Hello, I'm Alan Menard, Regional Chef for the Mountain West region. Brisket seems to be one of the most difficult cuts of meat to cook and carve correctly, so we're going to take you through an example of cooking the brisket. Brisket is the pectoral muscle of a cow. Because a cow stands on 4 legs, that muscle gets a lot of work. The more work that a muscle gets, the more sinewy, the more tough the meat is. Because of that, we need to cook brisket low and slow. We've all heard that term before, especially when we barbecue. This stuff is great for smoking, this stuff is great for barbecue. This is also 2 separate muscles with opposing grain. We have grain running through this way, and then there's a muscle on top of it with grain running this way. So when we get this thing cooked tomorrow, we will show you how to cut this properly. Okay, now we've placed our brisket in a roasting pan. This happens to be a 400 pan. If you're going to do this in multiple pieces, probably 2, 3 maximum in a 6-inch hotel pan. Other than that, what we're going to do is we're going to spice this thing up and throw it in the oven. So, I personally like to use garlic, black pepper, chili powder, and onion powder on my spice rub. Always put the onion powder on last because onion powder acts like a glue. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get this fat cap that's on top of this piece of brisket to dissolve. And when it dissolves, it's going to pull those spices down into the brisket. So very important that we put that onion powder on last so that when that fat starts to dissolve, it's not going to just wash the spices off your piece of meat. So we're going to start with a little garlic. Kind of smear that around a little bit. This is fresh chopped garlic. We can use garlic powder as well. Then we're going to put on some fresh ground black pepper. And then we're going to use some chili powder. Quite a bit. We're going to rub that into the meat a little bit. And then we're going to finish with some onion powder. Alright, when we have our spice rub done, we're going to put this in the oven again at 215 degrees, 215. We're going to put it in for 12 to 13 hours. The other thing we're going to do here is we're going to seal this particular pan up with aluminum foil. Alright, I do want to talk a little bit about cooking things overnight. You and I both know that we have managers who will come in to the kitchen, do their managing and closing kitchen checklist, and they'll shut off your ovens for you. So, guys need to develop a system that works for you and your management team and make everybody aware of. When I was a community chef, this is what I would do. Put my brisket in the oven. And then I would take a clean bar towel and I would just tie it around the handle of the oven. Everybody in my kitchen knew that that was a symbol that there's something in the oven that needs to stay in the oven and the oven needs to stay on. So hopefully that'll work for you, or develop something else that works for you as well. The brisket's been cooking for about 13 hours now. The first thing we need to do is we need to pull it out of the oven, and we need to set it on a cutting board and let it rest. Now, one of the easiest things you can do to see if this brisket is done, obviously it's been cooking for 13 hours, it's going to be done. But if you take a look at the fat cap and just poke it and see how gelatinous that is, that means that brisket is just perfect right now. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to pull it out. Usually the best way to do this is with a pair of tongs and an offset spatula. Grab it with two sets of tongs. Sometimes it has a tendency to fall apart. Here's another little handy dandy hint. Put a cutting board down inside a sheet pan, so that way when you carve it, all the juices are going to run off and stay inside the sheet pan and not all over your countertop. Alright, time to carve some brisket. As you can tell, brisket's a pretty fatty cut of meat, and I don't know of a single resident out there that likes a plate full of fat. So the first thing we're going to do right now is we're going to cut off the fat cap. Alright? Basically, we're just going to take a boning knife or your carving knife or whatever and remove this fat off the top of this. Lovely, isn't it? Much leaner, nicer piece of beef. Now, what I do want to show you while we're looking at this, remember earlier in the video I talked about how brisket is actually two muscles. If you will look at the grain here on the brisket, grain running out this direction. That's because this piece over here on my right, on your left, would be one part of the muscle. It's called the flat. And then the other muscle is on top of it. So the grains are actually running opposing to one another. This is what makes brisket difficult to cut. So, I want to talk a little bit about the grain of the meat. Everybody says, okay, we're going to cut across the grain. What does that mean? What I'd like you to think of is I'd like you to think of all this stringy material here as like rubber bands. Now, if I cut the brisket here and gave you that long piece of rubber band, you probably couldn't eat it. But if I cut across that rubber band and cut it into small pieces, you could then eat that, if that makes sense. Not that you'd want to, but you could. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to start carving a brisket. Brisket can only be cut in two directions. We're going to start cutting the brisket at the point opposite of the high point of a brisket. Okay, you'll notice that a brisket kind of slopes off to one side. You start at that high point and go opposite of it, and that's where the point is. If you can't remember that, flip this thing over and look at it, and you can see the grain running this direction. So we're going to cut at a perpendicular angle across that. A lot of people make the mistake of cutting this direction, because that's a nice short side there. We're going to cut across there. That's incorrect, and that's going to give you those big, long, stringy pieces of meat. So what we're going to do is we're going to just start by cutting at a 90-degree angle across that brisket. And we're going to continue across this brisket until we get to the second muscle portion of this. All right, I want to take a little bit of time right now and talk about cutting thick versus thin. All right, I see a lot of this in the communities that I visit, and that is especially like with pork loin or with brisket. Somebody will carve it 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thick, and this will be one serving of beef at this thick. Remember what I talked about rubber bands. You can imagine that a rubber band this long is going to be much more difficult to chew than a rubber band that's this long. A couple advantages to cutting thin. I personally think it looks better. I think it's perceived to be more tender because we've shortened those rubber bands. And it looks like you're getting more when you're actually getting the same amount or less. All right, let's continue to cut. What I'm going to do now is I'm basically just going to cut off a big slice up to the second portion of the muscle. So we would continue to slice this really thin all the way across. Now when we get to this point, the only other direction that you can cut brisket in is here, is across this. So we have a nice open angle here, so cut across this one. So we're going to rotate the piece of brisket and we're going to cut across here. Alright, to sum up, brisket's kind of a tough cut of meat, or it's a difficult kind of a cut of meat to work with. But done properly, it can be some of the best tasting meat there is. So please remember a couple of things. Low and slow cooking method. Come up with your own spice rub. Be creative, but low and slow. Try to cook it overnight if you can. The other thing, slice thin and start, and cut in only two directions. Remember to start opposite the high point of the brisket off of this point and cut across the grain until you get to the second muscle, then rotate and cut off of that very open angle, if that makes sense. Those are the two keys of making perfect brisket. Enjoy.